All right, so shadow work. It's like someone handed me this backpack, right?
Right.
And it's stuffed full of all these theories and tools and personal stories. And they said, go explore this thing, this shadow work. And, look at what you shared. We've got Carl Jung, Debbie Ford, even some of your own reflections. It seems like you're after more than just knowing about this shadow self.
Yeah.
You want to actually roll up your sleeves and work with it.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting, because the shadow, it can seem kind of intimidating at first, but all of those sources you share, they really highlight the practical side of it. Like, how can this actually help us transform?
Okay, so let's dive right in. Now, we know the shadow, it's not some kind of monster hiding under the bed, even though some days it might feel like it.
Yeah.
It's got to be more complicated than that, right? How do we even wrap our heads around what it is without getting lost in all that, psychology jargon?
Okay, think of it like, imagine a room, right? And it's beautifully lit. Now, what we often call the shadow, that's just the spots where the light doesn't quite reach. It's not necessarily bad or scary, it's just unseen. And just like if you flick on a light in a dark room, you can suddenly see everything. Shadow work, it helps us see those parts of ourselves that we've kind of pushed aside.
The out of sight, out of mind parts. And sometimes those hidden away places, they've got more than just dust bunnies, right?
Exactly. We're talking about like repressed emotions, desires that don't fit with how we see ourselves, even good qualities that we've shut down. Maybe they weren't celebrated or someone in our past made us feel like they were bad.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's get real for a sec. Why does this even matter? I mean, how does knowing about this shadow actually make our lives better? It seems like a lot of these sources you sent, they're saying that ignoring it has, consequences.
Oh, it definitely does. Think about it like those patterns we get stuck in, those frustrating things we do over and over again, even problems in our relationships, a lot of times they all come back to our shadow self acting up. It's like they're sending up a signal flare, trying to get our attention.
So instead of thinking, ugh, I'm doing that thing again,
Yeah.
we can see it like a trail, like breadcrumbs leading us back to something deeper.
Yeah. Like, take Debbie Ford's work. She doesn't just say, look at those patterns. She gives us a way to understand why they're there in the first place. Those patterns, they're often our shadow's way of saying, hey, something's not right here. Maybe there's a need that isn't being met, or an old wound that needs healing, or even some hidden talent that's just dying to come out.
Okay, so how do we crack the code?
Yeah.
How do we even begin to understand these messages our shadow's sending?
Well, you pointed out some interesting stuff in what you shared. One way is to think of Jung's 5 principles. They're like guideposts on this journey.
Oh, right. That video, Brenda Blanco, she did an amazing job explaining those. It didn't feel like, a lecture on Jung. It felt more like getting a map, with directions.
Totally. And what's really cool is how we can actually use these principles. Like, take owning your shadow. It's not enough to just admit those parts are there. We got to take responsibility for them. So instead of blaming our boss or the traffic or whatever, we got to look
instead
inward.
of saying, my boss is making my life miserable, it's more like, hold on, what is it about this situation that's making me feel this way?
Exactly. We go from feeling like a victim to feeling empowered. And that's where the real transformation starts to happen. And that shift, right, where we decide to take the wheel, that often unlocks the next level of this whole shadow work thing, seeing our projections.
That video, Kwasi Johira, that was a good one. It's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. But in this case, it's more like we don't see people as they are, we see them as we are.
Exactly. And you know what? A lot of times, those things we judge the harshest in other people, they're actually reflections of parts of ourselves we don't want to deal with. Classic projection.
But how can you tell? How do you know if it's really projection or if the person's just, being difficult?
Well, that's where that whole self-awareness thing comes in. We got to pay attention, especially to those really intense feelings that come up, the ones that just seem way too big for the situation. Ask yourself, why am I so reactive right now? Could this person be showing me something about myself that I don't want to see?
That's a powerful question.
Oh.
So instead of just getting swept up in all that judgment or anger, we can actually use those moments to look inward.
Exactly. And that's where journaling can be so helpful. You can process those emotions, explore what's triggering you, and uncover those patterns, all without
It's like having a
judgment.
direct line to our own, subconscious. You mentioned resources earlier. Any books that really stand out?
There's one called The Shadow Effect. It's actually co-written by Deepak Chopra, Debbie Ford, and Marianne Williamson. Talk about a dream team, right? They go really deep into the shadow self and offer some great tools for how to
I've got that
integrate
one.
it.
It's on my nightstand.
Yeah.
It's amazing how they combine that psychological stuff with spiritual practices.
Exactly. That's what makes shadow work so powerful. It's not just analyzing our thoughts, it's about connecting with something deeper inside ourselves, something
And that's
more
where those
real.
practical techniques come in, right? Things like
Mhm.
meditation, writing, getting creative. It's not just some, woo-woo stuff. It's like we're using tools to dig deeper and integrate those hidden parts.
Right. And the more we use those tools, the more we develop that inner observer, that part of us that can just watch our thoughts and emotions without getting like totally sucked in. It really is like building a muscle, use
It
it or
makes you
lose
think
it.
about those times when our shadow, it actually leads us to do things we're not proud of.
Mhm.
How do we forgive ourselves in those moments?
That's where atonement comes in. And I don't mean punishment or beating ourselves up. It's more about recognizing, acknowledging the harm we've caused, taking responsibility, and then trying to make things right.
We're human. We make mistakes.
Mm.
And those times, those moments where our shadow gets the best of us, they don't have to define us.
Exactly. And when we learn to be kinder to ourselves, it becomes a lot easier to be kind to other people too. And that's how the work we do on ourselves, that shadow integration, it ripples outward. It affects
Oh,
everyone.
perfect segue. Because that makes me think about the collective shadow. It's not just like our own personal stuff, right?
No, not at all. We have individual shadows, and then, society has its own shadow too. All those unresolved issues, the biases, the fears that we haven't dealt with, they show up everywhere. In our systems, in how we treat each other, everything.
It's like what we were saying about projection, but on a much bigger scale. We take our own shadows and project them onto groups of people because of their race, religion, who they love, anything. And then those projections, they become the foundation for prejudice, discrimination, even violence.
It's true. And those dynamics, they're fueled by what Jung called the shadow effect. It's this tendency for unconscious negative things to spread, especially when people are scared or uncertain.
And that feels, well, pretty relevant right now. Everywhere you look, it's division, people picking sides, conflict. It can feel, honestly, a little overwhelming. So if we're all walking around with these shadows, how do we even begin to deal with that on a bigger level?
It starts with each of us looking inward, doing our own work. The more people who commit to exploring their shadow selves, to understanding their own biases, healing their wounds, taking responsibility, that's how we create change. It starts with us.
It's like Gandhi said, be the change. But in this case, it's like, heal the shadow you want to see healed in the world.
I love that because it reminds us that we're not powerless. This inner work, it's not easy, but it's so important. It's our gift to the world.
That is a really empowering way to think about it. It's not just about us. It's about creating a world with more compassion, more justice. It's like we each have this responsibility, to shine a light in those dark corners, those shadows inside us, not just for us, but for everyone.
Right. And that light, it's not about judging or criticizing. It's about understanding. It's about seeing that those shadows, those wounds, those fears, they're just
Right.
part of being human. It's what connects us, even when it's, dark.
That's a good point. So, okay, someone's listening, they're feeling inspired, but maybe a little overwhelmed. Like, where do I even start with this shadow work? What's like a good first step? Something they can actually do today?
Just start by noticing. As you go through your day, pay attention to what triggers those really strong feelings. Could be anger, judgment, envy, even admiration. And don't get down on yourself for having those feelings. Just notice them.
Like hitting the pause button on autopilot. Instead of just reacting, we can choose to be aware.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it all begins. Once you see those triggers, then you can start digging deeper, like with journaling or meditation or even through art.
Find what works for you, right? What feels right for your journey. And speaking of journeys, we mentioned a few books. Any other resources that come to mind for people who want to learn more about shadow work?
Oh, totally. So besides the shadow effect, there's Man and His Symbols by Jung himself. It's a little tougher to get through, but it really lays the foundation for understanding his whole psychology thing, including the archetypes, like the shadow.
I've heard good things about that one. Got to go to the source. Now, what about people who are looking for a more spiritual approach? approach.
A Course in Miracles is amazing. It helps you cultivate self-awareness, forgiveness, and letting go of judgment, all super important for this work. And it's designed for self-study, so you can go at your own pace, figure out what resonates with you.
It's like having your own personal guide on this journey of self-discovery. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one last thought, a little piece of wisdom you'd want to leave our listener with about shadow work?
Don't forget to be kind to yourself, to yourself and everyone else. Remember, we're all a work in progress, always growing, always learning. The journey is the destination.
Beautifully said. It's not about reaching some perfect state of, enlightenment. It's about embracing the whole messy, beautiful, challenging process of becoming who we truly are. So, to everyone listening, as you start or continue on this journey, be kind to yourself, stay curious, and know that you don't have to do this alone.
And remember, the more light we shine on our own shadows, the brighter the world gets.
Love it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.